The myth goes like this. Sisyphus was a conniver and a meddler. He liked to have the upper hand wherever possible, especially in his dealings with the gods. At one point, Sisyphus locked up the Lord of the Dead, Thanos in some tellings, Hades in others, to keep from being taken to the underworld. When Ares got annoyed that no one was dying in wars, he hunted down the Lord of the Dead and freed him. The most well-known portion of Sisyphus's myth is his punishment. He pushes a stone up a hill, but when he reaches the top, a gust of wind sends him and the stone back to the bottom, and he must start again. My name is Wart, and this is Deus Ex Machina. Top to bottom. When the time came for Sisyphus to die, they sent Hades for him personally. He couldn't say he was surprised. Of course he was that important. Hades arrived with chains. Chains for little old Sisyphus? Whatever did he do to deserve such treatment? Well, quite a lot, actually, but that's a different story. "Hades, what brings the ruler of the underworld to my humble abode?" he asked, lounging back in his lavish throne. "You know why I'm here," Hades said, dour as ever. His face was blank, expressionless, his dark eyes fixed on Sisyphus like black holes trying to pull him into their depths. "It is your time." He held up the chains. Sisyphus sat forward, looking pointedly at the chains as if he'd never seen any before. He had a dungeon, he'd seen chains, but he had to play the part to get what he wanted. "My dear Hades," he said, "will those hold me? They look awfully flimsy." Hades' eyebrows rose, an actual expression on the Lord of the Underworld's face. Who knew Sisyphus could bring about such a miracle? When he spoke, Sisyphus almost thought he sensed amusement in Hades' voice, but perhaps that would be too much. "Believe me, Sisyphus, these chains could hold a god." "Is that so?" Sisyphus asked, standing and striding towards Hades. He was careful to stay out of reach. He had, not been the best to the gods of late, and he couldn't be sure Hades wouldn't simply grab him as soon as he had the chance. "Could I see, just to be sure?" He spread his arms, acting the innocent. "I wouldn't want you to go through all that trouble only for me to escape. Not that I would," he assured him quickly. "I take death very seriously." He did. That was why he was going to so much trouble to not die. "If you think I'm going to chain myself to satisfy your curiosity, Sisyphus," Hades said, voice dry, "you are sorely mistaken." "Doesn't have to be you," Sisyphus said, shaking his head. "I'm sure one of your fellow gods wouldn't mind participating in a demonstration." Hades glared at him, but he looked resigned, like he'd been expecting something like this, which explained the chains, Sisyphus supposed. "Please, Master Hades, I only want to make this as easy as possible for you." Hades snapped his fingers and Hermes appeared beside him. His red skin glistened with sweat, and he was breathing hard like he'd just run a race. He glared at Hades. "I was busy," he snapped. "You were taunting Apollo again," Hades answered, disinterested. "And this won't take a moment. Sisyphus here," he glared at the man, who tried to look as innocent as possible. Easy, as he was the most innocent person he knew. "Doesn't believe these chains will hold and would like a demonstration." Hermes' look of annoyance shifted to one of amusement. "Oh, so you want me to chain you up?" he asked. "No," Hades said. "I'm going to chain you." Hermes let out a peal of laughter and disappeared. He reappeared a moment later, an arrow in his shoulder, and glared at Hades. "This is your fault," he said, pulling the arrow out and tossing it aside. He sighed and held out his arms. "Fine, get it over with." Hades reached out with the chains. Sisyphus watched closely, wondering how this was going to go, trying to find a way to work it into his favor. Somewhere in the space of a blink, Hermes shifted, and suddenly he was holding the chains. In a moment, he had them locked around Hades' wrists. He grinned at Hades' glare. "Thieves' hands," he said, holding his hands up and waggling his fingers. "Have fun." He disappeared, leaving Sisyphus and Hades alone. Hades turned, met Sisyphus's gaze. Sisyphus looked surprised for a moment, but covered it quickly. A mortal might not have noticed, but Hades was glad to know this hadn't actually factored into Sisyphus's plans. Still, Sisyphus was nothing if not adaptable. He smiled and stood, striding towards Hades, hands clasped behind his back. "Oh dear, whatever shall we do?" he asked. "I don't suppose you have a, key?" He leaned over to look closely at the shackles. The metal was smooth, no hint of a keyhole. "There is no key," Hades said, grinding the words out through clenched teeth. "The only way to unlock them is with my magic." "Oh, so that's all then?" Sisyphus looked disappointed. "I suppose you'd better get yourself out of them and lock me up then." He straightened and held out his hands, waiting. Hades pulled in a slow breath, steadying himself. I cannot use my magic as long as the shackles are on. The grin that spread over Sisyphus's face as he dropped his arms back to his side sent a chill through Hades' body. Oh, I'm so sorry, Hades, Sisyphus said, his voice cloying and sickly sweet. That does present a problem, doesn't it? If I could get to my palace, I could remove them, Hades added, knowing full well that was never going to happen. Sisyphus's plot hadn't gone smoothly, but he had achieved his intended result. Hades wasn't going anywhere, and Sisyphus lived on. I'm afraid I can't let you go. Not while in such condition, Lord Hades, Sisyphus said. He snapped his fingers and gestured to Hades when a guard appeared. Take Lord Hades to our best guest room. He turned and met Hades' eyes again. And make sure you lock the door. What the hell is happening? Ares scowled at the image of the mortal realm he'd been watching. Some conflict, somewhere, just another bit of bloodshed to the god of war. Except nothing was happening the way it was supposed to be happening. People kept getting killed, but no one was dying. Hermes, Ares shouted, what prank have you pulled? Wasn't me, your deadliness, Hermes said, appearing on his throne. I had nothing to do with this particular brand of... He glanced at the battle and grimaced, shifting his train of thought. How can you watch this? It is war! It is glory! Hermes shook his head. He wasn't about to argue the merits of war with Ares. That would only end in pain, as he had learned from experience. All right, so it's glory, he said, rolling his eyes while Ares' back was turned. What's the problem, then? Ares rounded on him, his brow furrowed. In the light of Olympus, his blood-red skin shone like it was wet, and while Hermes' skin was also red, his was a respectable shade, nothing akin to bodily fluids, and he had to suppress a shudder at how similar Ares' skin looked to the pools on the ground in the mortal realm below. He managed to keep his expression neutral as he met Ares' gaze, waiting for the god of war to tell him what he already knew. No one is dying, Ares shouted, his voice booming. The throne seemed to shake, though Hermes hoped that was just Ares creating a godly illusion, and not an actual fault in the construction of the throne room. Given Hephaestus had spearheaded the remodel a few centuries ago, Hermes was inclined to believe it was an illusion. Is that a problem? Hermes asked, sliding down from his throne and sauntering over to get a closer look at the battle below. It looked just as bloody and pointless standing next to Ares as it had looked from the throne, and Hermes greatly regretted his decision. He pulled back and looked up at Ares. Doesn't that just mean it'll last longer? Ares growled, and it took all of Hermes' willpower not to cringe away. It isn't about how long it lasts, you fool. Oh, is it about how many people die then? No! Ares looked about ready to kill Hermes, which, while not permanent, would be unpleasant. Hermes took a step back and waited quietly. Ares pulled in a deep breath, then let it out slowly. Meditation techniques Artemis had tried to teach him eons ago. Apparently something stuck. It's about the whole of it, he explained. He still sounded murderous, but at least he wasn't yelling anymore. If no one dies, it's not really war, is it? I suppose that makes sense, Hermes said, though it actually made no sense. Still, he didn't want to talk philosophy with Ares of all the gods. I might know a thing or two about what's happening, he said. This was the risky portion. He wanted to draw Ares' attention to the matter because the confrontation was going to be amazing, but he didn't want to bear the brunt of Ares' anger, so he had to tread carefully. Ares glared down at him. Oh, do you, trickster? He asked, taking a step forward so he was looming over Hermes. Well, you remember that mess with Sisyphus? That mess was an oversimplification. The number of times Sisyphus had found a way to weasel out of things by blackmailing the gods was honestly embarrassing. That was why they'd decided his time had come and sent Hades to personally escort him to the afterlife. Ares nodded. Yes, he said, wary. I recall. Well, it didn't exactly go according to plan. What did you do? Ares growled, taking another step forward. Hermes raised his hands and took a step back. Nothing. It was just, we underestimated Sisyphus. He has Hades locked up in his house. What? Ares repeated. Did you do? I did nothing. Sisyphus asked for a demonstration of the shackles Hades brought, and Hades demonstrated. And you had nothing to do with it? Absolutely nothing. Ares nodded slowly, studying Hermes. Then how, pray tell, do you know about it? I am the messenger of the gods, Hermes said, sounding as affronted as he could. It's my job to know these things. Ares' brow furrowed. We're not finished, he said, then disappeared. Hermes blew out a sigh of relief and pushed away the images Ares had been watching before he too disappeared. It was probably a good time to go down and visit Persephone in the underworld, see how far the garden had spread in Hades' absence. household staff woke Sisyphus at some god-awful hour of the night because someone was pounding at the door demanding to be let in. "Let them in then, for God's sake," Sisyphus ordered. He got a bathrobe on and hurried to his main hall, hoping to be lounging on his throne when their nighttime guest arrived. Unfortunately, said guest wasn't waiting to be let in. By the time Sisyphus reached the hall, 2 of his staff members were cowering, and the god of war was looming in the doorway. The door spray of splinters scattered over the hardwood floor. "Where is the god of the dead?" Ares demanded, voice booming and echoing through the vast room. "Tell me, mortal, where is Hades?" "I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about," Sisyphus said. He wanted to sound cool and collected, but he could hear the tremor in his voice, and no matter how tightly he clenched his fists, his hands still shook. Ares wasn't at his full godly height, he wouldn't have fit in the house if he were, but he wasn't at a mortal height either. He stood broad and tall, and the way the dim light of the hallway fell on him cast sinister shadows across his face. Sisyphus struggled not to show it, but he was beyond intimidated. Ares strode towards him, arms crossed over his chest. "Where is Lord Hades, you puny mortal?" he said, voice a low growl. "I know he's here." "He's in the guest wing, Lord Ares," a servant cried out from where he crouched behind a table. "I can show you the way, just please let us live." "You fool!" Sisyphus glared at the man, but there wasn't anything he could do now. The man was up and leading Ares through the room to the guest wing. Sisyphus blew out a sigh and hurried to follow, trying to think of a way to salvage this. He really, really did not want to die. "In there, Lord Ares," the servant said, bowing low. "You have done well," Ares said. "You have my blessing." Cadmus, you have my blessing." Cadmus bowed low, caught Sisyphus's glare, and hurried away. Ares, ignoring Sisyphus's half-hearted protests, kicked down the door. The repair costs after this visit were going to be absolutely ridiculous. Hades stood from the bed where he'd been sitting, clearly fussing with his shackles. "Oh, thank Olympus," he said. He held his arms out. "Get these blasted things off of me, Ares." Ares took the shackles in his hands, and they came away from Hades' wrists. "How did this happen?" Ares asked, shifting his glare from Hades to Sisyphus. "One part this mortal's usual conniving, one part Hermes," Hades explained. "But now I'm free, I can take our friend here down to the underworld where he belongs." "Lord Hades, only let me say goodbye to my wife, I beg of you," Sisyphus said quickly, inching backwards. Hades sighed. "Fine, but we're coming with you." Ares looked affronted to be volunteered, but he said nothing as they followed Sisyphus back through the house to his chambers. He stopped at the door and looked back at them. "I'll leave the door open so you can see me," he said, "but please allow us some privacy." Hades nodded. Sisyphus pushed the door open and strode into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently shook his wife awake. She looked startled, glanced behind him at the gods, then met his gaze, her eyes wide with fear. He held a finger to his lips and pulled her to him, hugging her tight so he could whisper in her ear. "When I die, do not give me funeral rites," he said. "If my soul isn't laid to rest properly, I can't cross the Styx." "Sisyphus," she tried to pull away, but he held her tight. "I will cheat death," he whispered. He kissed her cheek and let her go. "Goodbye, my love," he said. He stood and faced the doorway where Hades and Ares stood. "I'm ready," he said. The sensation of the soul leaving the body is not a pleasant one. Typically, the dying don't feel it because, well, dying is distracting. Sisyphus's, however, was wrenched from his still-breathing body. He heard his wife gasp, and then his body went rigid, and he felt as though he were being ripped apart. And then he was standing on the shore of the river Styx, Charon and his boat waiting for him. "I'm afraid I have no coins," he said. Charon said nothing, only lowered his hooded head as though looking at Sisyphus's pockets. Sisyphus shrugged and slipped his hands into them, freezing at the cool feeling of metal against his skin. What had that woman done? "Oh dear, my mistake," he said, pulling them from his pocket and handing them to Charon. The ferryman stepped aside, and Sisyphus took his place on the boat. He sat in silence as Charon rowed them across. He hesitated at the opposite shore, but Charon loomed behind him and he stepped off, starting down the path toward the underworld. At Cerberus's feet, the path split 3 ways: Elysium, Asphodel, and Tartarus. Sisyphus stopped at the fork, ignoring the half-hearted grumblings of the souls that had to move around him. He stared straight ahead at Elysium. He knew he had no place there. He turned to the left, joining the surge of souls trudging towards Asphodel, but a paw came down in front of him. He tried to go around it with the rest of the dead, but Cerberus would not let him pass. With a heavy sigh, Sisyphus turned and walked the path towards Tartarus. Hades was waiting for him there. "You wanted your life to last forever," Hades said as Sisyphus approached him, "and so forever is your punishment." Sisyphus shook his head. "I don't understand," he said. Hades turned and gestured to a steep, looming hill. At its base, a boulder rested. "You will push that boulder to the top of the hill," he said. He met Sisyphus's gaze. "Forever." Hades disappeared, and Sisyphus studied the task before him. He wanted to just turn and walk away, but his soul moved of its own accord. He took his place behind the boulder and began to push, rolling it slowly and steadily up the hill. As he neared the top, he felt euphoric. He would do it. He would reach the top. A wind flared up, buffeting against him and his boulder. He struggled against it for a moment, but it was too strong, and in seconds he lay at the base of the hill, the boulder back where it had started. He stood, took his place behind the boulder, and began to push. Deus Ex Machina is written and performed by Wart Hill. The logo was designed by Maria Nicole. You can see more of Maria's work on her Instagram, Infatuated Coconut. If you have any questions or any myths you'd like to hear me take on, find me on Twitter at DeusExPod or send an email to deusexpod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.